Chapter 1. The footstep on the stair. It was a little after midnight when the incident occurred which drew Sherlock Holmes and myself into one of the most perplexing affairs of my association with that extraordinary man. I record the hour with precision, for I had glanced irritably at the clock upon the mantel not 2 minutes before the disturbance, and I remember thinking, as only a weary medical man can, that London at last seemed inclined to grant me a full night's rest. A yellow fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street, blurring the gaslight outside into a dull halo. Within our sitting room, the fire had sunk low, and Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen eyes half closed. To a casual observer, he might have appeared asleep. I knew better. The faint twitch at the corner of his mouth told me that his brain was still racing along some private track of speculation. "You are not abed, Watson," he murmured suddenly. "I was about to retire," said I. "Your violin prevented any earlier attempt." "My apologies," he returned without contrition. The Saracet demanded resolution. Before I could frame a reply, there came a sound upon the staircase, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably cautious. Both Holmes and I were upright in an instant. It was no hurried tread of a drunken lodger, nor the brisk authority of Mrs. Hudson. It was the stealthy placing of a foot, followed by a pause, as though the intruder listened after every step. Holmes's eyes shone. "A visitor," he whispered, "and one who does not wish to be announced." The tread came higher. The stair creaked faintly beneath the weight. Then silence. I confess, my heart beat somewhat faster. Holmes moved with cat-like grace to the table, extinguished the lamp, and motioned me back. We stood in darkness, the faint glow of the fire tracing his hawk-like profile. There came a hesitant touch upon our door, not a knock, but the timid brushing of fingers. Holmes flung it open. A woman staggered into the room. She was young, though terror had etched lines upon her face, which made her appear older. Her cloak hung askew, its hem damp with fog, and her gloved hands clutched one another so tightly that the knuckles gleamed white. Her eyes darted from Holmes to me, wide with a hunted expression I shall never forget. "You must help me," she gasped. They said you would not refuse." Holmes guided her gently to a chair and relit the lamp. "No one who comes in distress leaves this room unaided," he said quietly. "Pray compose yourself. Watson, brandy." She drank. With trembling lips, the color returned slightly to her cheeks, though her hands still shook. "My name," she began, "is Miss Eleanor Vane. If I remain where I am, I shall be murdered before morning." Such declarations are not uncommon in our line of acquaintance. Yet there was in her voice a conviction that chilled me. Holmes, however, displayed no surprise. He observed her with that swift, penetrating gaze which seemed to strip away every surface. "You walked here," said he calmly. "Yes, from Bloomsbury. You dismissed your cab 2 streets away, fearing pursuit. And you have not slept for at least 24 hours." The poor girl stared at him. "How can you possibly—" Holmes waved the matter aside. Later, tell us instead what hunts you. Her story came in broken fragments. She served as companion to an elderly gentleman, Mr. Alistair Pembroke, a scholar of obscure antiquities residing in a narrow house near Russell Square. The household was small. Pembroke himself, a taciturn valet named Briggs, and Miss Vane. 2 nights prior, Pembroke had confided to her that he possessed a document of immense value, a manuscript connected, claimed, to a scandal buried deep within the political history of Europe. He said men had killed for less, she whispered. I thought it was the fancy of an old scholar. Tonight, I know better. At 11:30, she had heard a struggle upon the staircase. Venturing out, she saw Pembroke lying at the foot of the stairs, his skull shattered. Above him stood Briggs, his face white as chalk. He fled at the sight of her. In terror, she seized her cloak and ran, pursued, as she believed, by unseen watchers in the fog. Why not the police? Mr. Pembroke warned me never to trust them in this matter. He said there were interests, powerful interests, that would silence the case. Holmes's fingers drummed softly upon the arm of his chair. And the manuscript. It is gone. His study was ransacked. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion. Watson, your coat. We go at once. Within minutes, we were in a hansom, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the wet stones. The fog lay thick as wool. Miss Vane sat between us, twisting her hands. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed upon the murk ahead. Are you certain that Briggs struck the blow? He asked. I saw no weapon, only Mr. Pembroke lying there, and Briggs above him. Appearances, murmured Holmes, are a treacherous currency. We reached the house in Bloomsbury to find a small crowd gathered and a constable barring the door. The blue lamp of authority cast a ghastly hue upon the facade. Holmes presented his card. We were admitted. The body still lay upon the tiled floor of the hall, covered with a sheet. A dark stain spread beneath the cloth. The air smelled of iron and damp wool. I knelt and lifted the covering enough to confirm what Miss Vane had said. The skull was crushed by a heavy blow. Holmes, meanwhile, was upon his knees, examining the staircase. He produced his lens and studied each step with minute care. His face took on that abstracted look I had learned to recognize, the outward sign of a mind assembling invisible machinery. Curious, he murmured. What do you see? I asked. He did not answer. Instead, he rose and moved to the door. The lock was splintered. Forced entry, said the constable. Holmes smiled faintly. Forced exit. He turned to Miss Vane. My dear young lady, you have brought us into nest of hornets. Your employer did not fall by chance, nor by a servant's rage. There are at least 3 men involved in this affair, one of them injured, one left-handed, and one who limps. The constable gaped. How in heaven's name? Holmes gestured toward the floor. Only then did I notice the faint, muddy impressions. Crossing the tiles, overlapping footprints, smeared in haste, yet distinct to his practiced eye. The game, said Holmes softly, is already afoot, and It began on the staircase, after midnight. He glanced at me, and I saw in his expression that rare spark of excitement which meant danger, complexity, and intellectual battle. "Come, Watson," he said. "London has whispered a riddle. Let us see if it dares to answer." And with that, we stepped back into the fog, unaware that the shadows watching from across the square had already marked us as participants in a drama, whose consequences would stretch far beyond a single shattered skull upon a Bloomsbury stair. Chapter. To a demonstration in tobacco, I slept little after our return to Baker Street. The image of the dead scholar upon his own staircase haunted my thoughts, and the terror in Miss Vane's eyes lingered long after the embers had faded in the great Holmes, however, appeared invigorated rather than fatigued. When I entered the sitting room at 9 o'clock, I found him already dressed, seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug, surrounded by a semicircle of papers, chemical jars, and an alarming quantity of tobacco ash arranged upon sheets of white card. The air was blue with smoke. "You will poison us both," said I, throwing open the window. "On the contrary," Holmes replied cheerfully, "I am preserving knowledge for the betterment of mankind. Pray do not disturb the stratification. That," he added, pointing with his pipe, "is trichinopoly. Observe the granular residue. Compare it with the fine grey dust of the Hungarian. I had learned that resistance was futile. You have been at this all night, productively so. I have extended my monograph on the 140 varieties of cigar, cigarette, and pipe tobacco ash. The criminal classes are lamentably conservative in their habits. Their ashes are signatures more honest than their faces." He handed me a card. Upon it lay a tiny smear of blackened powder. "And this?" I asked. "The ash recovered from Mr. Pembroke's staircase. It belongs to a cheap Balkan mixture favored by dock laborers and certain foreign agents operating in Limehouse. An interesting intersection of worlds, is it not?" Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. Miss Vane entered, pale but composed, her grief now tempered by resolve. Holmes rose and bowed with grave courtesy. "You have news?" he asked. "The police have arrested Briggs," she said. "They found blood upon his coat in his lodgings. He claims innocence, but they will not hear him." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Blood is a common language," he said. "It says little about grammar. Sit, if you please. We must arrange your safety. Watson, would you be so kind as to fetch the map?" I spread the large map of London upon the table. Holmes marked several points with a pencil. "You cannot return to Bloomsbury," he said. "Nor must you remain anywhere predictable. For the present you shall stay with Mrs. Turner in Kensington. She has sheltered more than one endangered client of mine and asks no questions." Miss Vane hesitated. "Will they follow me?" "They may try," Holmes replied calmly. "But they will find the trail complicated." She studied his face, and some measure of confidence returned to her. "Very well," she said. "I trust you, Mr. Holmes." When she had gone, escorted by a cab Holmes had summoned with elaborate precautions, he turned to me with sudden animation. "Now, Watson, we visit the yard. I would like to meet this Briggs." Inspector Lestrade received us with his customary mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. He stood beside his desk, thin as a rapier and twice as sharp. "You're late to the feast, Holmes," said he. "We have our man. You have a man," Holmes corrected gently. "Whether he is yours remains to be seen." Briggs sat in a cell below, a square-shouldered fellow with a heavy jaw and eyes reddened from sleeplessness. When he saw us, he sprang to his feet. "I didn't kill him," he burst out. "I swear." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then you will welcome clarity. Tell me what occurred." Briggs ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I heard the master cry out. I came from my room and found him fallen. Running, I chased him into the street. He struck me and fled. When I came back, the girl was screaming. And now they say I did it. Why not tell this to the police?" I asked. "I did. They say I made it up." Holmes stepped closer. "You are left-handed," he said abruptly. Briggs blinked. "I." "And you limp slightly on the right." Man stared. "How do you know that?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because you are not the limping man I seek." Lestrade snorted. "We have blood on his coat and motive. Enough servants kill their masters every day." "Rarely," said Holmes, "in a house containing the footprints of 3 additional men." Lestrade's expression darkened. "You've been tampering with my scene. I have been observing it. A distinction I commend to you." The inspector folded his arms. "Well then, enlighten me." Holmes described the overlapping prints, the forced exit, and the ash. Lestrade listened with increasing reluctance. "Even if you're right," he said, "at last, it proves nothing. We still have our suspect." Holmes turned away. "Hold him, if you must. But do not hang your case upon him. You will regret it." Outside the yard, Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled thoughtfully. "Briggs speaks the truth," he said. "He is frightened, but not guilty. You are certain. As certain as one can be without a confession from the true culprit. And we shall have that in due time." We spent the afternoon in Bloomsbury, Holmes revisiting the house with microscopic attention. He measured the staircase, scraped the floor, and examined the study where Pembroke's papers lay scattered like fallen leaves. It was there that Holmes uttered a soft exclamation. "What is it?" I asked. He held up a scrap of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Upon it was a fragment of a seal red wax, impressed with a faint outline of a double-headed eagle. "Russian," I said. "Very good, Watson. You are improving." He slipped the fragment into his pocket. "A scholar murdered for a manuscript tied to a European scandal, and a Russian seal left behind. Our circle widens." That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was unusually silent. Only once did he speak, and then in a tone so quiet I scarcely caught it. "They are watching us now." I glanced behind. The fog swallowed the street. "Where?" "That is their strength and their weakness. Men who believe themselves invisible grow careless." He smiled thinly. "And when they do, we shall be there." I felt a chill unrelated to the night air. The case had already moved beyond a simple murder. We had stepped into a contest of shadows, and I sensed that Holmes, for all his composure, relished the danger. Little did I know how swiftly that danger would escalate, nor how near it would come to claiming one of us. Before the truth stood revealed. Chapter 3. The Scholar's House. The following morning broke with a pallid light that struggled in vain against the London fog. Holmes had not retired at all. I found him seated at the breakfast table, his untouched eggs congealing while he pored over a stack of foreign newspapers. His eyes were bright with that feverish alertness which told me the hunt had advanced in his mind several stages beyond my comprehension. "You see before you, Watson," said he, tapping the papers, the echoes of our affair rippling across the continent. "I see only German print and my own ignorance." Holmes smiled faintly. A minor diplomatic scandal in Vienna, a vanished attache in Warsaw, a coded reference in a St. Petersburg column to a restored document, each trivial in isolation, together suggestive. He rose abruptly. "We returned to Pembroke's house. Yesterday I saw. Today I shall observe." The distinction, as always with Holmes, proved significant. The house stood sealed by police order. Yet Lestrade, whether from curiosity or exasperation, had granted Holmes temporary access. The constable at the door admitted us with a resigned shrugged inside. The air had the stale heaviness of interrupted life. A clock ticked somewhere upstairs with unnatural loudness. Holmes moved slowly through the hall, his gaze sweeping every surface. He did not speak for several minutes. I had learned patience. When the silence broke, it was with purpose. "The body fell here," he murmured, indicating the dark stain now chalked around. "But the struggle began 3 steps higher." "How? Can you tell?" He pointed to the banister, a smear of skin oil interrupted by splintering. Pembroke grasped it as he fell. He was struck above, not below. We ascended. Each stair seemed to creak in accusation. At the landing Holmes crouched again, his lens flashing. "Observe, Watson." A second set of scuff marks. The limping man paused here, to steady himself, to listen. Holmes corrected. He was guarding the rear. We entered Pembroke's study. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, illuminating the chaos of overturned drawers and scattered papers. Instead, he went straight to the desk and sat in Pembroke's chair, folding his hands. "One must inhabit the mind of the victim," he said softly. He closed his eyes. Minutes passed. "I confess, I grew restless." Then Holmes sprang up and crossed to the bookshelf. His fingers danced along the spines until one volume tilted slightly forward. He pulled it free. Behind it lay a narrow recess in the wall. "Empty. A hiding place," I breathed. "Precisely. And recently emptied. Note the dust pattern disturbed within the last 48 hours. Pembroke kept something here, separate from his papers, the manuscript." Holmes nodded. "But here is the curious element. The recess is too small for a folio. Whatever was hidden was compact. A packet, or perhaps a sealed envelope. On Byzantine coinage, an unlikely guardian for political dynamite." Pembroke had a sense of irony. While Holmes examined the shelf, I wandered toward the window. The fog outside pressed close, rendering the square a ghostly blur. As I stood there, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a silhouette lingering across the street. "Holmes," I whispered. He joined me instantly. "Yes," he said calmly. "Our audience." The figure vanished into the mist. "They grow bold," I said, "or desperate." Holmes returned to the desk and began sorting papers with swift precision. Most were scholarly notes, harmless in themselves. A list of dates paired with initials. "Appointments," I suggested. "Meetings," said Holmes. "Only a symbol." He showed it to me, a crude, double-headed eagle, hastily sketched. "The same mark as the seal," I said. "Indeed." Pembroke met his killer knowingly. A sudden knock downstairs echoed through the house. We froze. The constable's voice followed, raised in protest, then cut short by a heavier tread. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Company." We descended to find Lestrade confronting a broad-shouldered gentleman in an expensive overcoat. The newcomer's expression was one of polished indignation. "I insist." He was saying that I have every right to inspect my late colleague's effects. Holmes stepped forward. "And you are?" The man bowed slightly. "Professor Adrian Volkov, a friend of Mr. Pembroke's." His accent carried the faint cadence of Eastern Europe. His eyes flicked to Holmes, measuring. "Sherlock Holmes," said my companion pleasantly. A pause, brief, but charged. "Ah," said Volkov. "I have heard the name." "I should hope so," Holmes replied lightly. "It has been attached to several inconvenient truths." Volkov smiled thinly. "I mourn my friend," he said. "His death is a tragedy." "And yet you arrive with remarkable speed," Holmes observed. "News travels swiftly to the continent." Volkov's gaze hardened for an instant. "I was in London already." "Of course you were." Lestrade cleared his throat, sensing currents beyond his depth. "The professor may look," he said reluctantly. "Under supervision." Volkov inclined his head and moved past us into the study. Holmes watched him with the intensity of a chess player studying an opponent's opening move. When Volkov reached the bookshelf, he hesitated just a fraction. His hand brushed the very volume Holmes had removed. "There," Holmes murmured. "Confirmation." Volkov turned. "Did you say something?" "Only that grief reveals itself in strange gestures," Holmes replied. The professor's smile returned, but his eyes were cold. "I trust you will solve this crime, Mr. Holmes," he said. "For civilization's sake." "I always prefer truth to civilization," Holmes answered softly. Volkov departed soon after. The moment the door closed, Holmes exhaled sharply. "He is involved," I said. "He is central," Holmes corrected. "But not alone." He paced the hall, energy radiating from him. "The manuscript is no mere curiosity. It is leveraged political blackmail of the highest order. Pembroke possessed it. Volkov wanted it. And at least 2 others were willing to kill for it. And now it is gone." Holmes stopped and looked at me. "Gone," he said quietly. "My dear Watson, nothing is ever gone. It merely changes hands." At that instant, a shout erupted outside. We rushed to the door. The constable lay stunned upon the pavement, and a boy darted through the fog, clutching something in his fist. Holmes gave chase without a word. I followed, my breath burning in my chest as we plunged into the murk. The boy stumbled. Holmes caught him by the collar with effortless precision. "Easy," said Holmes. "We are friends." The child, wide-eyed and trembling, held out a folded note. "They told me to give it to the tall gent," he stammered. "Said I'd get a shilling." Holmes took the paper and released him. The boy vanished like a wraith. We stood beneath the gaslight as Holmes opened the note. His face did not change, but I felt the air grow colder. He handed it to me. It contained only a single line: "Withdraw, or the girl dies next." I looked up. "Miss Vane is in immediate danger." Holmes finished. He folded the note with meticulous care. "The game accelerates," he said quietly. "And our adversaries have shown their hand." For the first time since the case began, I saw not excitement in his eyes, but anger. "Come, Watson," he said. "We must move faster than fear." And with that, we vanished into the fog once more, racing against an enemy who had decided that murder was merely the opening argument. Chapter 4. The convenient culprit. We drove to Kensington at a pace which would have earned the driver a reprimand under calmer circumstances. Holmes sat rigid beside me, the threatening note folded and refolded between his fingers until it was no thicker than a blade. He had said little since reading it, yet the tension in him was unmistakable. When Holmes grew silent, it was never from uncertainty. It was the hush of a mind aligning its weapons. Mrs. Turner's house stood in a quiet crescent, respectable and discreet. Before the cab had fully halted, Holmes was on the pavement. He rang once, sharply. The door opened a crack, and Mrs. Turner's lined face appeared. "Yes, it is Holmes." She admitted us instantly. Miss Vane descended the stairs at the sound of voices. The relief in her expression upon seeing us was so profound that it was painful to witness. "You are safe," Holmes said at once. "But the danger is real. You must not leave this house under any circumstances." She clasped her hands. "Has something happened?" Holmes showed her the note. The color drained from her cheeks. "I have done nothing," she whispered. "Why do they pursue me?" "Because," said Holmes gently, "you saw what they did not intend any living witness to see." He turned to Mrs. Turner. "No visitors. No messages. If anyone insists, you send it to me at once." The woman nodded grimly. She had the air of one who had weathered storms before. When we returned to the street, Holmes drew a long breath. "They are tightening the circle," he said. "Which means we approach the center. And Briggs?" I asked. "If he is innocent, he is a convenient sacrifice." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Just so. Let us see how convenient it is." Scotland Yard, we found Lestrade in a state of triumph. He greeted us with the air of a man who has already composed his victory speech. "You're on time," he said. "We have a witness." He ushered us into an office where a nervous clerk sat, twisting his hat. The fellow leaped to his feet when we entered. "This man," Lestrade announced, "saw Briggs fleeing the house at the hour of the murder with a heavy object in his hand." Holmes regarded the clerk mildly. "You are certain of the time?" "Yes, sir." The clock struck 12 as he ran past. And the object? A club or a stick, something like that. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me," he said, "which direction did he run?" The clerk hesitated. "Why, toward Russell Square." Holmes smiled faintly, curious. "Because the mud upon Briggs's boot contains clay found only in the opposite direction, toward the river." The clerk's mouth opened and closed. I may have been mistaken," Lestrade scowled. But Holmes was not finished. "And you are left-handed," he added softly. The clerk started, as though struck. "How?" "Your ink stains," Holmes said, indicating the man's cuff. "And the tremor in your right hand when you hold your hat. A recent injury, perhaps. One acquired in a struggle." The clerk bolted. He did not reach the door. Lestrade's men seized him, and in moments the false witness was in irons, babbling denials that convinced no one. Lestrade turned slowly to Holmes. "You planned that." "I anticipated it," Holmes corrected. "Our adversaries required a witness. They provided one too quickly." The inspector's expression shifted from irritation to reluctant admiration. "Briggs may walk yet." "He muttered, 'He will,'" said Holmes. "But he is not our quarry." We left the yard under a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Holmes was animated now. His earlier anger refined into cold purpose. "They attempt to anchor suspicion upon the simplest figure," he said. "A servant with blood on his coat. A witness to confirm it. A tidy narrative for the newspapers. The truth, messier, therefore invisible to those who prefer comfort." We spent the afternoon tracing Pembroke's recent movements. Holmes visited clubs, libraries, and obscure bookshops where the scholar had been known to frequent. Everywhere the same pattern emerged. Pembroke had been agitated in the days before his death. He had spoken in whispers, cancelled engagements, and once, in a moment of drunken candor, declared that he held the fate of governments in his desk. At dusk, we returned to Baker Street, exhausted but no nearer the manuscript. Holmes stood at the window, watching the fog thicken. "They are protecting something larger than a document," he said quietly. "They are protecting an arrangement, with Volkov at its center." Holmes did not answer at once. "Volkov," he said at last, "is the visible edge of a blade. The hand that wields it remains concealed." A knock interrupted us. Not the timid brushing of fingers we had heard the night before, but a firm, official rap. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Lestrade's face grave. "There's been another incident," he said. Holmes turned sharply. "Miss Vane?" "No. A body in Limehouse. A foreigner, beaten to death in an alley. In his pocket we found this." He handed Holmes a scrap of paper. It bore the same double-headed eagle. Holmes's jaw tightened. "The circle contracts," he murmured. Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You think it's connected?" We rode east through streets that grew narrower and darker with each turn. Limehouse lay under a pall of smoke and suspicion. The alley where the body lay was slick with refuse. The dead man's face was unrecognizable, his skull crushed with brutal efficiency. Holmes crouched beside him. "Execution," he said softly. "Not robbery. A message." "For whom?" I asked. For us, Holmes replied. He searched the corpse with swift precision and withdrew a small metal token from an inner pocket. Upon it was engraved a number, 3. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. 3, he repeated. We are counting down. A chill crept along my spine. You mean, said Holmes quietly, that our adversaries believe themselves engaged in a game, and they have just informed us of the score. He rose, his face pale but resolute. Come, Watson. We must not allow them the next move. As we left the alley, I glanced back at the shrouded body and felt the weight of the case settle heavily upon me. What had begun as a scholar's murder had become a contest of symbols and threats, of hidden powers moving behind respectable facades, and somewhere in that darkness, I sensed the true architect of the affair watched with patient interest, waiting to see whether Sherlock Holmes would prove worthy of the challenge. Chapter 5. The inconsistency. Holmes did not sleep that night, nor did he permit me much opportunity for it. We returned from Limehouse in the small hours, our clothes heavy with the stench of the docks, and our minds burdened by the silent arithmetic of that engraved token. Baker Street felt unusually exposed when we entered, as though the very walls had developed ears. Holmes went straight to the chemical table and lit the lamp. Sit, Watson, he said. If I am to think, you must witness. It sharpens the edge of reasoning. He spread before us the objects gathered thus far. The scrap of Russian seal, the note threatening Miss Vane, the numbered token, and several grains of ash sealed in envelopes. He arranged them with almost ceremonial care. Let us review, he said quietly. Pembroke possessed a document. He was murdered by a group of at least 3 men. One has since been executed by his own associates. Why? To silence him. I suggested. Too simple. Silence could have been purchased. No, he failed. And failure in such circles invites demonstration. Holmes picked up the ash envelope. This mixture appears at Pembroke's house and upon the dead man in Limehouse. Therefore, at least one participant was present at both scenes. Continuity. He paused, his gaze drifting inward. And yet, there it was, the tone I had learned to dread and admire in equal measure. The note of dissonance, and yet what? I pressed. Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing. The staircase, he said. Everything returns to the staircase. I waited. The blow that killed Pembroke was delivered from above. He continued. The angle is indisputable. The assailants stood higher on the stair. But the footprints tell us the limping man remained below, guarding. Therefore, the killer was neither the limping man nor Briggs. That leaves Volkov, or a 4th man. Holmes finished softly. He stopped and looked at me with sudden intensity. Here is the inconsistency. The force required to crush Pembroke's skull was immense, greater than Volkov's physique suggests, but not brutal. The blow was delivered by a man accustomed to violence, a laborer or soldier. I felt a stir of excitement. Then Volkov is not the murderer. Holmes's expression did not share my triumph. No, he said quietly. He is worse. He is the mind that chose the murderer. He returned to the table and stared at the token engraved with 3. "They are counting," he murmured. "They miscount one element, and that is you." I blinked. "Me, Watson," said Holmes patiently. "You are present at every development. To an observer, you are indistinguishable from a participant. They will account for you. That is their error." He smiled faintly, and I confessed, the smile unsettled me. "Because they believe they see the whole board," he added, "and they do not." Before I could question him further, a rapid knock sounded below. Holmes's head snapped toward the door. "That," he said softly, "is urgent." Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young constable, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade sent me. Briggs, he's been attacked in his cell." We were at the yard within minutes. The corridors buzzed with agitation. Lestrade met us with a face like carved stone. "He's alive," he said shortly. "Barely." Briggs lay in the infirmary, his head bandaged, his breathing ragged. A smear of blood stained the pillow. The surgeon shook his head. "Strangled," he whispered. "Interrupted in time." Holmes examined the man's throat. "A wire," he said. "Thin. Professional." Lestrade cursed under his breath. No one entered that cell. Holmes's eyes flicked to the barred window. "Someone did not enter," he said. "They reached." He stepped outside into the narrow service alley. A length of wire dangled from above, almost invisible in the gloom. Lowered from the roof, Holmes murmured. Looped through the bars, efficient and silent. Stared upward, in my own station. "In your own city," Holmes corrected gently. "Do not take it personally." We returned to the infirmary. Briggs stirred weakly. His eyes fluttered open and fixed upon Holmes with desperate clarity. "The man," he croaked. Holmes leaned. "Close. Easy. Speak only if you can." "Tall. Scar. Across the cheek." His head lolled back. The surgeon intervened. "That is all," he said firmly. Holmes straightened. His face grim. "A scared executioner," he murmured. "A soldier, most likely. Our missing instrument." Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. "They're cleaning the house," he said. "First Limehouse. Now this. They're erasing every loose thread." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Then we must become a knot." Back in Baker Street, he locked the door and drew the curtains. "From this moment," he said quietly, "we assume surveillance. Speak nothing unnecessary. Write nothing unguarded." He sat at the violin and drew a single, low note that vibrated through the room like a warning bell. "The inconsistency," he said suddenly. I looked up. "It grows clearer." Pembroke expected betrayal, yet he kept the manuscript close. Why? Because he believed it safe in proximity to danger. I don't. Follow. Holmes smiled thinly. He hid it where thieves would not search, because they believed they had already found it. My heart quickened. "You know where it is." Holmes met my eyes. "Yes." I surged to my feet. "Then we must retrieve it." He shook his head. "Not yet. The moment we touch it, the board resets. They will know, and Miss Vane dies." The room fell silent, except for the hiss of the lamp. Holmes leaned back. closing his eyes. "We must let them believe they are winning," he said softly. "Only then will they step fully into the light." I realized with a chill that he had already moved several stages ahead, and that I, as ever, followed in the wake of a mind playing a game whose rules I barely grasped. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere within it walked a scarred man with a wire, a professor with a smile, and an unseen master counting down toward a conclusion Holmes alone seemed prepared to meet. Chapter 6. The Second Blow. The events of the preceding days had strained my nerves. The sixth morning of the affair shattered whatever composure I had managed to preserve. I was awakened not by Holmes, but by a violent hammering at our door that rattled the very frame. Holmes was already on his feet when I entered the sitting room, fully dressed and fastening his cuffs with infuriating calm. "You expected this," I said. "I anticipated acceleration," he replied. "Our adversaries are running out of expendable men." Mrs. Hudson burst in, pale and breathless. "There's been an explosion, Mr. Holmes." "In Kensington." The name struck me like a blow. "Miss Vane," I cried. Holmes was down the stairs before I finished speaking. The streets were chaotic. Smoke rolled low over the crescent where Mrs. Turner lived. A crowd had gathered, held back by constables. One side of the respectable row of houses was blackened and torn open like a broken doll's house. Glass littered the pavement in glittering drifts. I forced my way forward, my heart pounding. "Let me through, doctor." Inside, the air reeked of powder and scorched wood. Furniture lay splintered. A crater gaped where the front parlor had been. Holmes stood in the wreckage, his eyes scanning with terrible intensity. Mrs. Turner sat wrapped in a blanket, coughing, but alive. She seized my arm. "The girl," she gasped. "They took her." Holmes turned sharply. "Not killed." "No, dragged out through the back. I saw them to men. One had a scar." Holmes's jaw tightened when, moments before the blast, Holmes crouched at the edge of the crater. He picked up a fragment of metal and turned it in his fingers. "Crude," he murmured. "A distraction, not an assassination." He rose and strode to the rear door. The alley beyond bore fresh wheel tracks. "A carriage," he said. "Heavy. They planned extraction, not murder." I felt a surge of helpless fury. "They have her." "For the moment," Holmes replied coldly. "Which means she is valuable. Valuable hostages are kept alive." He knelt again, examining the mud. His face changed not with alarm, but with something far more dangerous. Certainty. "Ah," he whispered. "What is it?" He pointed to a partial print. The limping man. He was here. Then, all three, all remaining pieces. Holmes. Finished. They gather. He stood and turned to me. "This is the escalation I warned you of. They believe pressure will force my withdrawal. Instead, they have concentrated their forces." "You sound pleased," I said bitterly. "I am focused," he corrected. "Emotion clouds precision. Precision saves lives." We returned to Baker Street in grim silence. Holmes locked himself in his bedroom for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was transformed. A ragged beard shadowed his face. His clothes hung in shabby disarray. His posture had altered subtly. His shoulders bent, his gaze dulled. Before me stood, not Sherlock Holmes, but a worn, dockside laborer. "You're going undercover," I said. He gave a faint grin. "Watson, you are improving at a rate that threatens my vanity." He handed me a revolver. "You will remain here. If a message comes, you will decode it using the book cipher on the mantel. Burn every scrap after reading. And you." "I'm going to Limehouse," he said, quietly, "where men vanish cheaply and secrets are traded by the pound." He paused at the door. "If I do not return by dawn," he stopped, then shook his head. "I will return." And he was gone. Those hours were among the longest of my life. Every creak of the stair set my nerves aflame. I paced, smoked, reread Pembroke's notes, and cursed my own impotence. The fog thickened outside until the world seemed reduced to the circle of lamplight within our rooms. At 2:30 in the morning, a pebble struck the window. I rushed to it. A figure stood below, half swallowed by mist. He raised a hand in a peculiar gesture, 2 fingers crossed, then lowered. "Holmes," I ran downstairs and opened the door. He slipped inside like a shadow and collapsed into the chair, breathing hard. His disguise was smeared with grime and blood, not his own, as he quickly assured me. "They have taken her to a warehouse on the river," he said. "Volkov is there, and the manuscript. You saw it." I confirmed it. My heart leaped. "Then we go to the police, Holmes," seized my wrist with startling force. "No." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because," he said softly, "the police are compromised." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Lestrade," I whispered. "Not Lestrade," Holmes replied, higher. He released me and leaned back, closing his eyes. "The manuscript is not merely political blackmail," he continued. "It is proof of an agreement, a covert pact between men in our own government and foreign agents. Pembroke discovered it. Volkov meant to retrieve it quietly. Instead, it became blood." My mouth went dry, and Miss Vane, "A witness," said Holmes, "and leverage against me." He opened his eyes. The firelight caught them, and I saw they're not anger, but iron. "Resolve. We end it tonight," he said. "How?" Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the numbered token engraved with 3. He placed it on the table beside the Russian seal. "They believe they are counting down," he murmured. "They think the final move is theirs." He looked at me and smiled the thin, terrible smile of a strategist who has already seen the end. "They are wrong." Outside, somewhere along the invisible river, a captive girl waited in darkness. Armed men guarded a secret capable of shaking governments. And Sherlock Holmes, alone and disguised, had walked into the center of their lair and returned with a plan I could not yet fathom. I loaded my revolver with shaking hands. The night was not finished with us. It was only reaching its climax. Chapter 7. The false trail. Holmes allowed himself precisely 7 minutes of rest. I timed it by the clock upon the mantel. For I sat watching him with the anxious vigilance of a nurse beside a wounded soldier. He lay motionless, eyes closed, yet I knew his mind had not ceased its relentless turning. When the 7th minute expired, he rose at once, as if summoned by an internal bell. "We must mislead them," he said. "You have already found their den," I replied. "Why mislead?" "Because," said Holmes, reaching for his violin case, "they expect pursuit. What they do not expect is retreat." He opened the case. Inside lay not the violin, but a carefully arranged assortment of disguises, papers, and small mechanical tools. He selected a pair of spectacles and a neatly folded telegram form. "By dawn," he continued, "every ear in London will hear that Sherlock Holmes has abandoned the case." I stared. "You mean to surrender?" He looked up sharply. "My dear Watson, surrender is a performance. Reality is negotiation." He scribbled swiftly upon the telegram and handed it to me. "Read. Withdrawn from Pembroke affair. Stop client. Unsafe stop. Returning all papers. Stop." Holmes felt a jolt of disbelief. "They will think you are frightened." "They must," Holmes said calmly. "Fear invites carelessness." He rang for a messenger and sent the telegram to 3 newspapers and, more importantly, to an address in Limehouse he had extracted during his undercover excursion. "Now," he said, "we wait." We did not wait long. By mid-morning, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Lestrade arrived in a state of thunderous indignation. "You've quit," he demanded. "I have," Holmes replied serenely, pouring tea. "The affair exceeds my professional comfort." Lestrade stared at him as though he had sprouted horns. "This isn't like you." Holmes shrugged. "I am not invincible, Inspector. I value my health." Lestrade stormed out, muttering darkly about wasted genius. The moment the door closed, Holmes's expression changed. The languid indifference vanished. In its place stood the hunter again. "They will test the truth of it," he said, quietly, as if summoned by his words. A carriage halted outside. A note slipped beneath the door. Holmes retrieved it with tongs. Inside was a single line. "Wise men know when to step aside. Remain wise." Holmes smiled faintly. "They believe me," he said, "and Miss Vane. They will relax their guard. A hostage is dangerous only while contested. If I am removed from the board, she becomes insurance rather than bait." He moved to the window and watched the street. "Tonight," he added softly, "we retrieve her." The day passed in a strange parody of normalcy. Holmes lounged, played idle melodies, even dozed. Yet I could see the tension coiled beneath the surface. Every sound from the street sharpened his attention. At dusk, he rose. "Time," he said. We left Baker Street separately. I followed his instructions to the letter, taking a circuitous route through crowded streets until I reached the river. There, beneath the shadow of a warehouse crane, Holmes emerged from the fog like an apparition. He was again disguised this time as a bent old sailor, complete with tar-stained hands and a rolling gait. "You were followed," he murmured. "No? Good." He handed me a dark cloak. "The warehouse is watched." We enter as ghosts. Lee crept along the wharf. The Thames lapped blackly against the pilings. Ahead loomed the warehouse. its upper windows faintly lit. A single guard smoked by the door. Holmes touched my arm. "Observe." He tossed a pebble into the water downstream. The splash echoed. The guard turned instinctively. In that instant, Holmes glided forward, struck once, and caught the man before he fell. The fellow slumped silently, dopped inside. The air smelled of rope and damp timber. Voices drifted from above. We moved like shadows up the stairs through a crack in the door. I saw them. Volkov, the scarred executioner, and the limping man. Miss Vane sat bound to a chair, pale but alive. Upon a crate beside Volkov lay a leather packet, the manuscript. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Remember," he whispered, "we are not here to fight. We are here to conclude." Before I could question him, he stepped into the light. "Good evening, gentlemen." The room exploded into motion. The scarred man lunged, but Holmes had anticipated the move. He fired once. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, spinning him to the floor. The limping man froze. Volkov's eyes widened, not with fear, but admiration. "I suspected," Volkov said softly, "that you might return." Holmes inclined his head. "You miscalculated. Only an hour." Volkov rested a hand upon the manuscript. "You have lost," he said calmly. "The girl dies if I move this hand." Holmes smiled. "No," he replied, "she does not." Volkov hesitated, because Holmes continued quietly, "Your employers value that document more than they value you. And I have already arranged for its contents to reach them, along with your name attached." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Volkov's face. "Impossible." Holmes nodded toward me. "Dr. Watson posted the copies at noon." I stared, stunned, yet I held my silence. Volkov's gaze darted between us. "Like a weight changing sides. You bluff," he whispered. Holmes's eyes were cold. "Test me." Seconds stretched. The scarred man groaned on the floor. The limping accomplice edged toward the window, then stopped under Holmes's steady aim. Volkov exhaled slowly. "You are a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes. I am a practical one." Volkov released the manuscript. "Take it," he said. Holmes cut Miss Vane's bonds and guided her behind me. Only when she was safe did he lower the revolver. The game, it seemed, was over. And yet, as we left the warehouse, Holmes's face remained grave. "They yielded too easily," I said. "Yes," he replied softly, "which means the true player has not yet spoken." The fog swallowed the river behind us. Somewhere beyond it, I felt certain. Another mind watched aboard and prepared its final move. Chapter: Kate. The trap is set. Miss Vane did not speak during the journey back from the river. She sat, wrapped in my cloak, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon some inward distance. Holmes rode opposite us in the hired carriage, the leather packet resting on his knees. He did not need to. Whatever secrets it contained, he already carried their weight. Only when we reached Baker Street and the door was locked behind us did he allow himself a breath of visible relief. "You are safe," he told her gently. "For the first time since this began, you are truly safe." She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "It is over?" she asked. Holmes hesitated. "The violence is over," he said carefully. "The consequences are just beginning." He guided her to a chair and poured a small measure of brandy. Her hands still trembled as she drank. "I want you to listen to me," he continued. "Tomorrow you will leave England under another name. Arrangements have already been made. You will receive an allowance sufficient for independence. You will never speak of Pembroke, of Volkov, or of this document. If anyone questions you, you'll remember nothing. Can you do that?" Tears welled in her eyes. "If it means living." "Yes, it means more than living," Holmes said quietly. "It means ending the chain of deaths that began on that staircase." She nodded. Mrs. Hudson prepared a room, and Miss Vane withdrew. When the door closed, I turned to Holmes. "You planned her escape before tonight," I said. "Of course," he replied. "Rescue without the aftermath is negligence." He placed the manuscript upon the table and finally opened it. Inside lay a sheaf of thin papers covered in dense handwriting, seals, and signatures. I recognized enough diplomatic phrasing to feel my stomach tighten. "It is real," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "A covert treaty," he said. "Illegal, treasonous, and exquisitely inconvenient. Certain British officials promised concessions in exchange for foreign intelligence. Pembroke discovered the correspondence and intended to expose it. And Volkov, a courier," Holmes replied. "Important, but replaceable. The true architect sits comfortably in London society." He tapped a signature near the bottom. "There," he said softly, "the unseen hand." I read the name and felt the room tilt. "A cabinet minister," former Holmes corrected. "Recently retired." Which means he has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "And he knows you have this." Holmes smiled thinly. "He knows I will have it. By now Volkov has reported failure. Our hidden master prepares his last defense." "And what is that?" Holmes closed the packet and tied it neatly. "He will attempt to remove me," he said simply. A chill ran through me. "Then we go to the authorities at once." Holmes shook his head. "He is the authority. That is the elegance of his position." He walked to the window and looked out into the fog. "So," he murmured, "we must use a different court." The following afternoon, Holmes sent invitations, discreet, handwritten notes delivered by trusted messengers. By evening, our sitting room was prepared as though for a small salon. Lamps were lit, chairs arranged in a semicircle. The manuscript lay hidden beneath the floorboard Holmes had loosened earlier. "You are hosting a party," I said incredulously. "A tribunal," he corrected. "The guests arrive one by one. Lestrade, grim and curious. A senior magistrate known for incorruptibility. A representative from the Foreign Office. And finally, precisely on the hour, the retired minister himself, Sir Reginald Harrow." He entered with effortless charm, silver-haired and impeccably dressed. "Mr. Holmes," he said warmly, "I hear you have been involved in a dreadful business." Holmes bowed slightly. "I regret the necessity of your presence, Sir Reginald, but the truth has a habit of inviting witnesses." Harrow's eyes flickered just for a moment. We took our seats. Holmes remained standing. "Gentlemen," he began, "the murder of Alistair Pembroke was not an isolated crime. It was the violent suppression of a political secret. The men who carried it out are neutralized. The mind that ordered it sits among us." Silence fell like a curtain. Harrow laughed lightly. "Surely you jest." Holmes bent, lifted the floorboard, and withdrew the manuscript. He laid it on the table. "I never joke about murder," he said softly. Harrow's smile died. The magistrate leaned forward, scanning the pages. His face paled. "Good God." The Foreign Office representative swore under his breath. Harrow rose. Abruptly, "This is outrageous. Forged nonsense." Holmes's voice cut through the room. "Your seal is authentic. Your signature is verified. And your courier, Professor Volkov, is in custody." A beat. Harrow's shoulders sagged. For the first time, the man looked old. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It was necessary. The balance of Europe was purchased with blood," Holmes said coldly. "Pembroke's and others." Harrow's gaze darted toward the door. Lestrade stepped forward. "It's finished," the inspector said quietly. Harrow sank back into his chair. The trap had closed. Holmes did not gloat. He merely watched with the detached sadness of a surgeon observing a terminal diagnosis. When the officials departed with their prisoner and the manuscript, the room felt strangely hollow. Holmes stood alone by the fire. "You have toppled the government," I said softly. He shook his head. "No, I have corrected a lie. Governments topple themselves." Outside, the fog began to thin for the first time in days. A pale moon emerged, washing Baker Street in silver. Holmes picked up his violin and drew a slow, reflective melody from the strings. "The game," he said quietly, "is almost done." Almost. For even then, I sensed that one final reckoning remained, not with the law, but with the consequences of truth itself. Chapter 9. The Last Reckoning. The Arrest of Sir Reginald. Harrow did not bring the relief I had anticipated. Instead, London seemed to hold its breath. The newspapers spoke in cautious euphemisms of a private inquiry in a matter of national delicacy. Names were not printed. Details were buried. Yet beneath the polite language, I felt the tremor of something immense shifting under the city. Holmes, curiously, grew quieter. For 2 days he scarcely left Baker Street. He read dispatches, burned letters unopened, and received visitors in whispers. Once I found him standing at the window long before dawn, watching the empty street with an expression I could not decipher. "You are uneasy," I said. "I am attentive," he replied. "There is a difference. Sir Reginald is in custody." "Yes," Holmes murmured. "But men like Harrow do not fall alone. They fall attached to other men who prefer not to be dragged down with them." The implication chilled me. "You believe there will be retaliation?" "I believe," said Holmes softly, "that a final attempt will be made to rebalance the scales. That attempt came sooner than either of us expected." It was late afternoon when Lestrade burst into our rooms. Without ceremony, His face was ashen. "Harrow is dead," he said. I rose to my feet. Dead. In his cell, Lestrade continued. "Poison, smuggled in somehow. The official report will say suicide." Holmes closed his eyes briefly, and the truth strayed. Hesitated. "The truth," he said quietly, "is that someone wanted him silent." A heavy silence filled the room. Holmes turned slowly. "Then our adversary still breathes." Lestrade nodded grimly. "And he's not finished. There was a message left in Harrow's pocket, addressed to you." He handed Holmes a folded scrap. "Holmes, read it once." His jaw tightened. He passed it to me. "Debts are paid in full. Midnight. The staircase." My pulse quickened. "The staircase. Pembroke's house." Holmes nodded. "He summons me to the origin," he said softly. "A fitting sense of drama." Lestrade swore. "It's a trap." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied calmly. "Which is why I must attend." "You're not going alone?" I said at once. His eyes met mine. "No," he said. "You are not." There was no argument left to make. The house in Bloomsbury stood dark and abandoned when we arrived. Police seals hung broken from the door. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating. Midnight struck as we crossed the threshold. The hall smelled faintly of dust and old blood. Holmes raised a hand for silence. We moved slowly toward the staircase, that narrow theater where the entire tragedy had begun. A figure stepped from the shadows above. He was tall, elegantly dressed, his face hidden by the angle of the light. Only his voice emerged, smooth and cultivated. "Mr. Holmes, you are punctual." "And you," Holmes replied, "are predictable." The man descended a step. "You have caused considerable inconvenience." "You murdered a scholar," Holmes said coldly. A soft laugh echoed. "Harrow was a fool. He panicked. I am more composed." The man stepped fully into the light. I recognized him with a jolt. Lord Ashcombe, a quiet financier often mentioned in political circles. A man whose name carried influence without spectacle. I had seen him once at a reception. I had not noticed him. That, I realized, was his strength. "You," I breathed. He inclined his head slightly. "I prefer obscurity," he said. Holmes did not move. "You orchestrated the pact," he said. "Harrow signed. Volkov executed. Pembroke discovered. And you cleaned the trail." Ashcombe smiled faintly. "Efficiency is underrated." His hand moved. A pistol gleamed. Everything happened at once. Holmes lunged. I fired. The shot shattered the banister inches from Ashcombe's hand. He staggered back, firing wildly. The report thundered in the narrow hall. Wood splintered. Smoke filled the air. Holmes struck him with brutal precision. The pistol clattered down the stairs. They struggled, locked in silence except for harsh breathing. Ashcombe was stronger than he looked, driven by the ferocity of a cornered mind. They crashed against the railing for a heartbeat. They hung there. Then the wood gave way. Both men fell. I shouted and rushed down. Ashcombe lay twisted at the foot of the stairs, neck broken. Holmes lay beside him, stunned but breathing. I knelt. Holmes. His eyes opened slowly. "Well," he murmured faintly. That was theatrical. I laughed, a broken, hysterical sound of relief. Police arrived moments later, summoned by Lestrade's precautionary watch outside. The house is filled with lantern light and official voices. Ashcombe's body was removed. The final architect of the affair left the world as violently as he had shaped it. Holmes sat on the stair where Pembroke had died. His expression distant. "It ends where it began," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. He looked at the dark stain still faintly visible on the tile. "Violence," he murmured, "is a poor archivist. It preserves nothing. It only erases." For once, he sounded tired. We left the house as dawn crept over Bloomsbury. The fog thinned into pale ribbons. London resumed its breathing. Cups rattled. Bakers opened shutters. Life advanced, indifferent, to the dramas buried beneath it, back in Baker Street. Holmes sank into his chair and lit a cigarette. "No newspapers," he said. "No headlines. The truth will be diluted into rumors." "And Miss Vane?" I asked. "Already gone," he replied. "By now she is crossing the channel." He exhaled slowly. "Good. I studied with him. You saved her. You exposed the conspiracy. You ended the murders." Holmes smiled faintly. "I corrected a problem," he said. "Nothing more." The fire crackled softly. Morning light touched the violin on the mantel. After a long silence, Holmes spoke again. "Watson," he said quietly, "remember this case not for its scandal, but for its lesson. And that is—" He looked toward the window where the city glowed gold on the newborn day. "The most dangerous crimes," he said, "are committed not by monsters, but by reasonable men who believe themselves justified." He stubbed out the cigarette and reached for the violin. A gentle melody filled the room, not triumphant, not sorrowful, but reflective. A closing note, and as I sat listening, I understood that this case born from a single footstep on a staircase after midnight would never be printed in full while the men it threatened still cast shadows. It would live only here in these pages, waiting for a future quiet enough to bear its truth. Holmes played on, and London, vast and unknowable, turned another page. Chapter 10. The Quiet After. On the weeks that followed the death of Lord Ashcombe, London performed its oldest and most remarkable trick. It forgot. Not entirely, of course. Cities never truly forget. They bury. The newspapers spoke cautiously of a private inquest, of a tragic fall during a disturbance, and of confidential diplomatic irregularities resolved internally. Names were omitted. Connections blurred. The public accepted the explanation with the weary appetite of a metropolis accustomed to swallowing mysteries whole. Yet for Holmes and myself, the echoes of the case lingered long after the official silence descended. Miss Vane wrote once a brief letter posted from the continent, its return address deliberately vague. She thanked Holmes in simple, earnest terms, and spoke of a small town by the sea where no one knew her name. She had found work, she said, and sleep had at last returned to her. Holmes read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. That, he remarked quietly, is the only verdict that matters. Briggs, the unfortunate valet, was released with apologies that satisfied no one. He vanished from London soon after. Whether he sought distance from memory or from danger, I cannot say. Holmes made discreet inquiries and learned only that the man had taken passage north. A sensible direction, Holmes observed. Cold climate discouraged recollection. As for Volkov and the surviving accomplice, they disappeared into the machinery of diplomacy. There were whispers of extradition, of quiet exchanges conducted in embassies after midnight. Holmes never pursued confirmation. Once a matter enters the bloodstream of governments, he told me, it ceases to belong to individuals. It becomes absorbed. Life at Baker Street resumed its outward rhythm. Clients returned. Holmes accepted some, refused others, with absent-minded waves of the hand. He played the violin with renewed intensity, long, searching passages that filled the rooms with a strange mixture of melancholy and clarity. I recognized in those melodies the residue of the case, not guilt, nor pride, but contemplation. One evening, nearly a month after Ashkim's fall, I found Holmes seated cross-legged on the hearthrug, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The manuscript, or rather, a single copied page of it, lay in his hand. "You kept a fragment," I said. "Insurance," he replied mildly. In memory, he did not look up. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Which part?" "Interfering." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, interference is my profession." He turned the page toward the firelight. "What I regret," he continued softly, "is that Pembroke believed truth alone would protect him. He mistook exposure for immunity. And you do not." Holmes fed the page to the flame. It curled, blackened, and vanished. "I believe truth is a tool," he said. "Like any tool, it must be wielded with care. Too little, and injustice thrives. Too much, and the structure collapses upon the innocent." The paper was gone. Only ash remained. I watched him in silence. There was no triumph in his face, only the steady calm of a man who has measured the cost of his work and accepted it. "Will the world change because of this?" I asked at last. Holmes shook his head. "The world does not change," he said quietly. "It adjusts, and then it continues." He rose and moved to the window. Outside, Baker Street shimmered with lamplight and mist. A cab rattled past. Ordinary life, stubborn, resilient, indifferent. "Consider," he went on, "how close we came to losing her. A single misstep, a single misread footprint, and Miss Vane would be a name on a coroner's list. Instead, she walks freely beneath another sky. That is enough change." He turned back to me. "You see, Watson, our victories are not measured in headlines. They are measured in absences, the crimes that do not occur, the lives that continue unnoticed." His words struck me with quiet force. In all my years beside him, I had celebrated the brilliance of his deductions, the elegance of his solutions. Yet here, in the soft afterglow of danger, I glimpsed the deeper current that guided him. A fierce, almost private devotion to the preservation of fragile human futures. The fire sank lower. Holmes reached for his violin and began to play. The melody was simple. No dazzling flourishes, no intellectual gymnastics. It was a tune one might hum while walking alone at dusk. And in that simplicity lay its power. It spoke of endings that were not endings, of wounds that closed, of shadows that receded just enough for light to return. I sat back and let the music carry me. In my mind, I saw again the staircase in Bloomsbury, the dark stain upon the tile, the terrified girl in our doorway after midnight. I saw Ashcombe's cold eyes, Volkoff's measured smile, the silent arithmetic of men who believed themselves beyond consequence. And over all of it, I saw Holmes, tireless, infuriating, magnificent, stepping into the narrow space where logic confronts brutality and refusing to yield. When the final note faded, the room felt larger. Holmes lowered the violin. "It will not be recorded," he said, quietly. "This case." He nodded. "Not while certain names still echo in Parliament. History has a delicate digestion." I smiled. "Then it will remain with me," I said, "until such a time as truth can bear daylight." He regarded me thoughtfully. "You are a dangerous archivist, Watson. I am a loyal one." The room slipped into darkness, lit only by the embers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city breathed beyond the glass. Somewhere, a clock struck midnight, the same hour at which the affair had begun. Holmes listened to the chime. Another staircase, he murmured. Another night. It never ends. "No," I said softly. "But sometimes it pauses." He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Yes," he said, "sometimes it pauses." And in that pause, in the fragile quiet earned at such cost, we sat together, detective and doctor, mind and witness, while London slept, unaware of how narrowly it had been spared. A deeper darkness, it is there I choose to leave this account. Not with the fall of a villain, nor the exposure of a conspiracy, but with the small, hard-won stillness that followed. For in that stillness lies the true measure of Sherlock Holmes, not merely the solver of mysteries, but the guardian of moments, in which ordinary life is allowed, against all odds, to continue. The staircase is silent now, and the night, at last, has passed.